Deirdre, thank you so much for being a part of this video. I call it the COVID tonic, so as to sort of alleviate some of the anxiety that people have about this terrible pandemic. Welcome, and let's talk a little bit about the pandemic, about politics and economics. The first thing I want to talk to you about, so your new book is called Why Liberalism Works, How True Liberal Values Produce a Freer, More Equal, Prosperous World for All. So how would you rate the performance of liberal countries in tackling the pandemic and contrast that with the authoritarian or populist regimes?
Well, the problem is that I think it's obvious, I think everyone agrees, that early in such an epidemic, coercion is justified and desirable early. Just as in the case of a forest fire, or an invasion by Canada of the United States, which I tell you, keeps me up at night worrying about those damn Canadians. So if the Canadians come to northern Maine, that's the time to strike. Not wait until they've conquered all the Northeast and then get your thing going. So the same thing's true here. And of course, authoritarian governments are good at exercising tyranny. And so some of them, China, for example, exercised tyranny, bang, closed off Wuhan and so forth. An extremely interesting example is Vietnam, which has done very well. With a big publicity campaign of the kind of socialist revolutionary sort, and just grabbing people and making and testing, lots of testing. But of course, so have many liberal countries. Now, of course, there's a spectrum here. New Zealand has done an excellent job. Early. The most prominent one is South Korea, and these are quite good examples. But then, of course, there's the kind of sloppy policy of countries like Italy, France, especially the UK, and most especially the United States. So I don't know. It's not terribly surprising that fighting the forest fire early is something that an authoritarian government can do well.
And there were probably, some people say that many of these countries are to be found in Asia, where they already had a dry run with different types of other flus before. So they were kind of ready, or at least.
Yeah, that's right. That appears to be true of Vietnam, for example, which said, we've been through this before, the various kinds of viruses from China.
Okay, but it would be wrong to say that just because China, say for example, or has done a better job, that we should try to be like China. We should be China for a day, or.
That's the danger. That's the inference that some people are willing to make. In fact, of course, it goes back much longer, because there's this talk of the China model of economic growth. And it said, well, being a violent authoritarian country, but allowing people to start factories more or less when they want, if they've paid off the Communist Party official. Oh, that seems to work pretty well, but it's not as if central planning worked in China. It's failed, as it's failed everywhere. So the China model argument I always contrast with the Indian model. India is a somewhat crazy democracy, and yet it too has grown extremely fast by liberalizing.
Let's talk a little bit about the American response. Not just your favorite person who is sitting in the Oval Office, but here's what I want to run by you. So I have a lot of progressive friends who seem to think that if only you put the right people in charge, you can tackle emergencies like this one in a much better way. But having lived in Washington for 20 years, I sort of feel like
it's never the right kind of people.
Yeah, I mean, Washington really doesn't resemble West Wing very much. It sort of resembles Veep more than anything else.
That's right.
And so I suspect that if you had super smart and super competent people in charge, you would have marginal improvements, but I don't think that would help in any way with the incentive structure, over-regulation, over-bureaucratization, the growth and the suffocating effect of bureaucracy, such as what happened with the CDC testing.
That's the big
would
one.
you care to opine about that, but also try to give the viewers a bit of a insight as to the economics of bureaucracy and growth of government?
Well, certainly, as P.J. O'Rourke, the American humorist, expresses it, giving more money and power to government is like giving bourbon and the car keys to a teenage boy. And all the incentives are wrong, as you say. Now it is true that the unhappy transfer of power from Congress to the executive that's been going on now since shortly after Watergate, in a way, was premised on the thought that there'd always be a responsible adult in the Oval Office, and now we have an irresponsible child. So, yeah, to that degree, our friends on the left may have something. I mean, Obama, for example, would have done a much better job on this. I think it's clear. But you're absolutely right. The sort of fundamental incentives of the Food and Drug Administration and the CDC and the whole government bureaucracy is to protect their jobs. I mean, it's the whole point that James Buchanan made, that which shocks some Europeans when you say this. After all, it's fairly plausible that government officials and politicians have their own interest partly in mind, even if only partly. And that's enough to create the wrong incentives. I mean, every child knows this, of course. Yeah, I come from Chicago, and we're always making jokes about the Chicago way, which is corruption. As long as we make the jokes, the politicians are safe. When we get seriously angry about it, they'll have to be concerned. There's a long trend, as Bob Higgs is, among a number of other people, has pointed out, of increasing size of government, increasing reach of government. And that, I think, has more to do with ideology than any material incentives. This is a separate point. There has been, in the last 100 years, for example, a shift of the meaning of the word liberal. 100 years ago, it meant what you and I mean by it. Now it means sometimes sweet social democrat. It means moderate socialism. Sweden is always being held up as an example of this, but observe how the Swedes have handled the plague. So there are things going on. There are the standard incentives to corruption. Power tends to corrupt, said Lord Acton, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there's a slide towards more and more absolute power being put into the executive branch. This crazy case before the Supreme Court today that about does Congress have any oversight power over the president is indicative of how far we've gone. So I think all the bad things that you can think about the federal government are true. That it's got the wrong people, that it's got the wrong incentives, and the historical ideological trends are unfortunately against a free society.
One of the things that perhaps exacerbates the problem is that a lot of bureaucrats are risk averse.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's clear in the case of the FDA and the CDC.
Yeah,
they are. I mean, you aren't old enough, perhaps, to have a vivid awareness of when the FDA got really conservative, which was after the now I'm going to forget the word, the drug that was used heavily in Europe. Why am I forgetting this? Which caused birth defects. And the FDA, in its conservative way, hadn't allowed it into the United States. And ever since then, it's been really proud that it didn't let a bunch of stuff into the United States. And it's gotten crazy, I think. Things that work perfectly well in Germany aren't allowed to be used in the United States.
Isn't it bizarre? I mean, shouldn't we have a rule that if something is safe enough to be sold in the United States, it should be safe enough to sell in Europe and vice versa?
Exactly.
It makes absolutely no sense to have these two parallel systems of approval.
Well, my own analysis of the problem, not just with COVID-19, but in general with the health system of the United States, is that it's all about an amazing pile of monopolies. The physician's monopoly to start with, and it's monopoly of the prescription power and the restrictions of entry into medicine. A long time ago, I had a Turkish friend who was a brain surgeon who had performed 500 brain surgeries, but couldn't get licensed in the United States without practically going back to medical school. And then
that's an amazing story. You know, I come from a medical family. Both of my parents are actually medical doctors, and they wanted to emigrate to North America, to the United States, but it was impossible. They would have to go basically get another degree.
It's completely absurd. And then the easy, the one that everyone knows about is the prohibition on importing drugs from Canada. Mm-hmm. My mom was paying $1,000 a month for her medicine, and she noticed that you could get it for $500 in Canada, so she started doing that. And and the government threatened her with jail. Okay, sick old lady, we're going to put you in the slammer if you try to save $500 a month.
I'm laughing, but it's not a laughing matter, is it?
Yeah, I know, it's very, and so, look, these government agencies could be much more flexible. In fact, as you notice, one of the effects of the plague is that temporarily they're abandoning all their regulation.
That's ridiculous.
And which shows maybe the regulation wasn't such a good thing in the first place.
Right, yeah.
It also shows a kind of panic because they're going to get blamed, and they ought to be blamed. And there's this tremendous faith. Some years ago, about 10, maybe it was 10 years ago, I heard on NPR the just retired chief or head of the Food and Drug Administration. And the announcer said, introducing her, name was Margaret Hamburger, that she controlled a fifth of the US economy. I thought, what, wait a second, this one bureaucrat, fifth? Yeah, food and drugs. And we would do much better with a freer.
Do you think that Americans are going to, I'm sure Americans are learning for the first time about things like certificates of need.
Oh, God Almighty.
Okay, can you explain to our viewers what the certificate of need is?
Well, I to my shame, I haven't paid much attention to the healthcare system because I'm old and you're paying for it. Thank you very much, by the way.
Pleasure. Well, the certificate of need is basically where...
I understand what it is. It's about hospitals. If you want to open a hospital, which is a desperately important thing in rural neighborhoods, for example, and out in the countryside, where they've been closing hospitals like mad. If you want to, you say, well, look, I'm going to open a hospital, or I think I can make money at it, or I'm a public spirited person who wants to put my church's money behind it. The other hospitals, if there are any, have to be consulted because you have to get a certificate of need, a word that gives an economist the creeps. I hate the word. A certificate of need, which is approved by the existing hospitals, but it's not approved. But this is very general. In Holland, in order to open a drugstore, you need to go to the to the town government, and then they consult with the existing pharmacies. And surprise, surprise, these pharmacies say, "Oh no, we don't need another pharmacy."
So that's the argument about monopolies.
Drugstores are exactly, because the key is that these monopolies, which perform so badly, feed into the regulatory system and support it. They support it in Congress, among other places. And so this whole sort of it's gummed up, as we say. The machinery is all filled with chewing gum or something, that it doesn't work because of this, military industrial complex and the healthcare industrial complex, and one complex after another, tied in with politics. Allocating by politics is a very bad idea, although I emphasize, in the early stages of an epidemic like this, there's a case for vigorous coercive action.
One last comment on this, and that is that also my understanding is that nurses in one American state couldn't perform similar duties in other American states.
I was married for 30 years to a nurse, so I know this very well. And Joanne had a license in Massachusetts, and then she had in Vermont, and then she had to get recertified in Illinois. And again, it's one of these things where they show that it's silly when it breaks down in the middle of an epidemic. Nurses come from California to New York to volunteer. And at first they said, no, you can't volunteer. You're not certified in New York. And I said, oh, wait a second. Oh, I guess we better set that aside temporarily.
Yeah,
and it's not just nurses. Look, in 1950, 5% of occupations in the United States required a state license. Now 30% of them do.
Mm-hmm.
So this is pazzo, this is loco, this is insane. And it's getting more and more insane.
Let's switch gears a little bit and let me ask you this. Does every sophisticated society have to end up where we have ended up. In other words, as societies evolve and they become complex, richer perhaps, more populous, the bureaucracy just mushrooms as one layer is placed upon another. And then, of course, the special interests capture the bureaucracy. And ultimately, do all societies have to be ultimately strangled by this sort of dead hand of bureaucracy of government, or is there an escape?
Well, it certainly is a danger, and the escape is ideological. That is, look, economies were growing quickly, populations were growing quickly, development was happening in the 19th century. And yet, in one place after another, the impulse to socializing every decision was resisted. Now, not perfectly, but it was, that was how it should be. And but in the 20th century, it's my view that ideas matter. But Bob Higgs, by the way, came to the same conclusion, that it's the idea of liberalism losing its prestige. And I was very struck, a cousin of mine, and by the way, is a spy. She works for the CIA. We, of course, don't know exactly what she does, but she controls actual spies, as far as we can tell. She said to me once, "I'm so tired of keeping secrets." But anyway, I said, I think we're overregulated. And she said, well, I understand, but don't you think a complex society needs complex regulation? And in very well-disposed people who don't want a China Xi Jinping supervisory society with cameras all over the place, even though they work for the CIA, that's a very common opinion, that a complex society needs a complex regulation, which of course is exactly the opposite of the truth. We, readers of Hayek, understand that it's quite the contrary, that the more complex the society is, the less the arrogance of regulation and supervision and so on is plausible. I just finished a short book with Arturo Mingardi,
yes,
against Mazzucato, this American, Italian, English economist, who wrote in 2013 a book called The Entrepreneurial State. And then 2018, another kind of statist, not just kind of, another statist book. And that's her view, that of course we need to go down that path that concerns you and me. So that's the desirability and the cause. Then the question is there an inevitableness about it in the politics? And I have to admit that there's kind of a strange economies of scale in this political economy. The bigger the economy, the government gets, the more advantageous is it to corrupt it. Mm-hmm. The more it's worth spending money in Congress or anywhere else you can to get the power of the government. The most famous example that I like to talk about is the Mickey Mouse Protection Act of 1998. Mickey Mouse was about...
which extended the protection
by 20 years. So it increased the absurdly long copyright in the United States of 50 years after the death of the creator, namely Walt Disney himself, to 70 years, because the Walt Disney Corporation went to Congress and for a surprisingly low price purchased it. Well, if the government patents and copyrights have their own special problems, let's not get into them, but if the government were small and competent, as I would wish and you would wish, then it wouldn't be worth corrupting.
Yeah, I keep asking my progressive friends, what would happen to all the lobbyists on K Street if there was a fundamental separation between the economy and politics? Would they exist? I don't get very far in when I ask questions like that, but I think it's a fundamental one, is that they would have no reason to exist. They would have no job to do if they couldn't get goodies from the government, corrupting a lot of people in the process.
Here's a very simple case. Every congressional term, some good-hearted congressperson proposes to move to the German system of income taxation, where the government, which already has all your W-9 forms and everything, knows what your income is, sends you a bill. They do it in Estonia too. Mm-hmm. And if you don't like it, you can argue about it. But but guess who stops it every time? H&R Block, the income tax filing, income tax preparing firm. That's just, it goes on and on. But it's not something new, by the way.
Let's change the tracks a little bit and get a little bit more philosophical. So Milton Friedman, whom you knew, I'm sure you knew also Hayek one day.
I did not know Hayek, but I knew Milton.
So Milton Friedman obviously said that tackling of pandemics is a key competence of government. And you clearly agree with that viewpoint. But are you comfortable with the shutdown, or would you be more comfortable in the Swedish model, do you think?
I think I'd be more comfortable in the Swedish model if we were in Sweden. But the United States is, as you can easily see by just turning on the news, is not Swedish. It's not obedient. It doesn't trust the government. It's not, there's a kind of screw you irresponsibility that a lot of Americans have, which you can see on TV when they crowd into restaurants in Colorado in violation of the most common sense behavior, which to prevent from hurting other people. Donald Trump and Pence not wearing face masks. I mean, this is crazy. So I wish we could do the Swedish model, but we can't because we aren't Swedish. And across the straits in Denmark, or across the mountains in Norway, they've done the closed down alternative. Now they're gradually coming out of it. But of course, the problem is it's a second best, obviously, because if you do it quickly, you end up. Greece, of all places, has done well.
Yeah, Greece
has under 200 deaths. 200. I mean, it's substantially below 200. That's it, because remarkably they jumped on it. So once you've not jumped on it, once you have a raging problem as the United States and Britain has, then I guess you've got to do the lockdown. Look, we all know what the problem is. The problem is testing. And had it been done early, then we would have had enough tests to jump on the few cases here and there to fight the beginning of the forest fire, instead of waiting until it was 300 miles across.
Well, this is certainly a lesson that we won't forget, and hopefully will be.
Well, I don't know. We keep saying we won't forget it. Every time it happens, we won't forget it, and then we forget it. So I hope that we get. Look, the contrast with Obama is very sharp. Obama looked at the Ebola threat and took care of it, along with other countries and the very corrupt and stupid World Health Organization. But on the other hand, they did the job. And, the contrast is quite striking. They managed to confine it at considerable expense. George Bush even was alarmed, horrified by the AIDS crisis in Africa, and he actually did something about it. By the way, AIDS and Ebola are cases observed where we still don't have a vaccine. So it's not at all obvious that I think we will, but I'm told, I don't know, but it can be that you don't ever get a vaccine, in which case you have to manage it.
You mentioned the word trust in terms of Sweden. I keep wondering, what do people mean by that? For the following reason. So the people of Sweden trust their government to do the right thing. Now, some people say, this is because Swedes are all alike, it's a homogeneous society, but there are plenty of homogeneous societies where people don't trust their government. And I'm beginning to wonder if part of the reason why the Swedes trust their government is because they have a much deeper faith in Swedish meritocracy. In other words, they believe that the people who run the different government organizations are actually people who are supposed to be there. Whereas very few Americans believe that people who run government agencies in America are really competent. Would that be correct assessment?
Well, yes, but I think it varies inside the United States dramatically. I grew up in Massachusetts, in Boston, in the 50s and 60s, fantastically corrupt. Then I moved to Chicago, lived there for 12 years, fantastically corrupt. Then in 1980, I moved to Iowa, and it was like moving to another planet. It was astonishing. I met a road contractor at a cocktail party early in my stay in Iowa, and he told me his company was close to the mutual intersection of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. And he said, when I bid a road building job in Wisconsin, I fill a paper bag with unmarked bills and give it to the county commissioner. That's Wisconsin. In Minnesota, I write out a large check to the so-called Farmer Labor Party, which is the name of the Democratic Party in Minnesota. In Iowa, if I do either, I go to jail. So he has to keep remembering. Now let's see, where am I? Oh yeah, I'm in Iowa. And so there is a great variation, and there are some parts of the United States that operate much more like Sweden.
Okay.
People in Iowa trust their government, and on the whole, I lived there for 19 years. It's competent.
So let's talk a little bit about negative externalities. So clearly, parents who refuse to vaccinate their children, or rather, let me put it differently. What's a liberal's response to parents who refuse to vaccinate their children, who then go on to infect other children? Or what's a liberal's position on forcing people to stay at home, even though they are healthy, but they could potentially spread the disease more widely? What is?
It depends on. It seems to me it depends on the numbers.
Okay.
If it's like the common cold, if the infection rate is like the common cold, the infection rate combined with the danger of death and disfigurement and so forth is like the common cold, then I'm happy to let individual incentives to avoid getting a cold, wash your hands a lot in the winter, and to sneeze like this and so forth. I'm perfectly willing to that to work. And indeed, for ordinary flu, which, by the way, could change any day to become the 1918 flu. So let's be a little careful about that. But still, ordinary flu, we've got vaccinations. Every old person has a tremendously large incentive to get the vaccination. It doesn't work perfectly. So every year, tens of thousands of Americans die of influenza. But there's not much more than that the government, activist government, or individual incentives to self-protection can do about influenza in its present form. So there you are. But when the number gets up to what it appears to be with this novel coronavirus, what, between 2 and 3, what we've learned to call R naught. If you just allowed it to go, how much would it infect people? It's between 2 and 3. And measles is 16. If you didn't do anything about measles, one person would infect 16 others. It's that contagious. That's why the Native Americans couldn't put up a resistance to the coming of the Europeans. Not because the Europeans were such great soldiers, but because the Native Americans were dead.
So you brought up the subject of history. So let's talk a little bit about history. And that is, what are the most salient lessons from economics, economic history, and philosophy that we should keep in mind as we emerge from the pandemic? So let's take them in turn. What about economics? What does economics have to teach us? The one lesson that people should remember as we try to get from the pandemic.
Well, that there are externalities, there are spillovers, but spillovers are defined socially. There's a pronounced tendency among economists to think of them as kind of technological. Oh, there's smoke, and therefore that's an externality. But if I wear an ugly dress, that's an externality. In Saudi Arabia, they have a ministry of dresses. But just because you're offended by my terrible dress, I have one in the other room. I could go put it on if you wanted to. That doesn't mean that we should bring in the closed fist of the government. So it's a social decision. And there's a rather deep problem, which I've written some in the last couple of years, which is that everyone's connected with everyone else. So the attempt to compensate for your action that affects me is a recommendation for the government to take over everything, for us to become children in the household of the government, of the state. And there's no snappy philosophical solution to this.
Are you talking about something like you didn't build that, or?
That's part of it, and indeed, in fact, it goes it's very deep, because look, if you buy a loaf of bread, I can't have that loaf of bread. Now you may think, well, yeah, so what? Well, so to speak, it's a tort. To express it in economics again, you buy the loaf of bread, you slightly increase the price of bread for everyone in the society. You add up all those teensy epsilon increases in the price of bread, and they add up, surprise, surprise, to the price of bread. You can show that in a diagram. So the slightest action, to express in kind of Austrian terms, human action is interference. Human action affects you for better or for worse. And if we start going around thinking of externalities as just anything that affects you, you can't. So there has to be some stopping point down the slippery slope. And it has to be something like rights or the social agreement to allow free trade to go on and so forth. As soon as you start interfering with this and start protecting this person or that, there's no reason to stop.
It's almost like constitutional scholars keep talking about limiting principle. In other words,
yeah, that's right. That's it. There has to be a limit. Look, it's as you know, a fundamental constitutional problem, which the Supreme Court is dealing with today, is what are the limits of executive power? We all agree that there has to be an executive power, that there has to be some cop, some member of the police force, someone doing stuff. Okay. But as the founding brothers and John Stuart Mill and everyone else says, wait a second, there's got to be limits on this, or else the slippery slope down to complete tyranny is inevitable.
Yeah, well, we are not constitutional scholars, but one of the interesting things that's emerged is compatibility of the shutdown with fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution, such as, speech and assembly. I don't know how that's going to be.
Well, but, it's an excellent example because it is about margins and how much and limitations. Because obviously the right to free assembly is not a right to riot. A riot is an assembly that's doing violence to other people or to property, right? That's what you mean by a riot. If all that people did is assemble and sort of stand there harmlessly 6 feet apart, there would be no issue.
What about lessons from economic history and philosophy? I mean, you've taught both for a very long time. So if you put on that economic historian hat or philosopher hat, what do you find?
Well, I find that for one thing, this has happened before. The plague of Justinian, the plague of Athens twice during the Peloponnesian War, the Black Death, which, by the way, started in China in 1331 and undermined the prestige of the Mongols, who were in charge in China and had been for about 130 years at that point, because it was evident to the Chinese that the Mongols had lost the mandate of heaven.
Fingers crossed it will happen again, right?
That's the point.
Oh, okay.
That's exactly the point. Will this experience we've had with incompetently managed plague policy result in a reduction of the mandate of heaven for authoritarian governments? Or will the successes, whether your very first question on the authoritarian side or the democratic side, result in increased pressure for it? Because it seems to me, to be philosophical about it and to some degree historical, there are two tendencies in humans. Let's think of in very simple terms. We were hunter-gatherers in small bands for actually millions of years. And even Homo sapiens, which is what we all are nowadays, it was a very long time, 300,000 years, essentially, of hunter-gathering. And that's a very egalitarian and very free culture or politics, because it's very easy to kill someone you don't like. So there's a very high incentive for people to get along without crushing each other. Then comes agriculture. And agriculture puts the landlord on a horse with a sword in charge. And as Rousseau said, that leads to, he didn't quite say it, he in fact encouraged authoritarian governments, but he said that's the source of violence and power in the society. And people love their freedom because of the hunter-gatherers, and they love the man on the white horse, the father figure, as well. And that's what we face. Do we want to go the way of Iceland or something on the one hand, or Argentina on the other? Do we want a free society or a authoritarian society?
So are you saying that liberals, classical liberals like you and I, and libertarians are really modern age hunter-gatherers?
Yes, we are. And I moved from being a hunter to being a gatherer. I'm very proud of it. I'm here with my sister. She cooks. She's a very good cook. I'm starting to gain weight. I don't like it, but I do the vacuuming, and I clean I keep the kitchen clean. So we're all here in a little band.
Let's. I want to be respectful of your time, so let's finish with Deirdre McCloskey, the Economist.
You said economist, not communist.
The Economist, definitely not a communist. So, has globalization gone too far? Let's take the two most pertinent aspects of globalization. One is production of goods. A lot of people are saying that the supply chains are overextended. We need to shorten them. We need to bring manufacturing back home. And travel. It's obviously much easier to spread a virus when you are an 8-hour flight away from another continent. So what's Deirdre McCloskey's response to those people who are attacking globalization?
That they're wrong. And there are two ways of making the argument. One is that the reassembly of Pangaea, this is how you can think of the modern world. 177 million years ago, there was one continent. There weren't any other continents, just one. And about then, they started to break up. And having broken up, a niche for, say, placental, and is that the right word for them? The Australian type of animal could go off by itself and have its own little world. Now the top predator can, because we're moving around, because humans are moving around, top predators of animals, plants, and bugs move very fast, as though it were one continent. And unless we want to go back to, the world in which I grew up in when I was young, with lots of restrictions on travel, lots of restrictions on investment and migration, and I think even if we went back to that, we'd still have this problem of Pangaea. So that's from the biology. But so far as the economics is concerned, again, it's a kind of a logical point. If you want to shorten the supply chain, why don't you shorten it to your house? I have right over there, I'm trying to learn how to play the accordion, which I bought from the Czech Republic, you'll be glad to know.
Wow.
And it's a beautiful little machine. I could go over and get it now and play it for you if you wanted, except I'm completely incompetent, so it wouldn't be good. But I can't, what? I'm supposed to sit in my apartment in Chicago and make my own accordion? It's completely stupid. If the argument is that we bring the supply chains inside the United States, why not inside Illinois? Why not inside Chicago? Why not inside the South Loop? Why not inside my apartment? And that's the basic argument is that we should be allowed to, it's part of freedom to be allowed to trade with anyone we want. If Juan wants to come from Colombia to trade with me, he should be allowed to. Or alternatively, I import his coffee from Colombia. I'm allowed to trade with him. So there's a deep sense in which, our freedom to engage with other people on all kinds of things, intellectually as we are here, or in trade, is fundamental to our freedoms. And if we go down the road of protection and obstructing supply chains, look, after this is all over, you can bet every responsible CFO or COO or CEO in the world is going to be working on thinking up ways of ensuring against the breakdown of supply chains. It's obvious. It'd be very irresponsible if they didn't, having seen what this can do.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't sympathize at all with this idea, and of course it's part of the danger that our friends on the left or on the right, both sides, because we're neither. We liberals are not on this left-right spectrum of large government violence. They will try to use the crisis as an argument for their point of view. Fascism on the one hand, communism on the other. And I say to hell with them.
I think that would be a wonderful, wonderful way to end, to say to hell with them. But I must ask one more question. The younglings. You said that you were growing up in the 50s and the 60s, and so you obviously have seen much more than people who are millennials or younger. Apparently, there's a generation which is even younger than millennials. I don't even know. But what would be your message of hope to them? I mean, you've had your share of travails. You've seen, as I said, a lot of things. What do you say to a 17-year-old high school student or a 19-year-old college student? Wise words from Deirdre McCloskey for kids struggling with the pandemic.
Well, that's the great misfortune that if they're coming into the workforce right now, it's nasty. But they should be comforted by the truth that they'll get jobs eventually, and they should prepare for a lifetime of work and life. And I'm a big enthusiast for liberal arts, which I believe prepares you to have a full life, whether or not you're rich or not. So I urge them to be of good cheer and go into medicine.
That too shall pass. That's
this too shall pass.
Yeah, that too shall pass. Deirdre McCloskey, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, dears, and thank you all.
Thank you, and have a good night.